A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. The wind tore through the barren plain, dry and merciless, carrying with it the grit of a world that had forgotten softness. It was a biting wind, the kind that found the seams in a man's coat and settled deep in his bones, a constant reminder of solitude. Elias knew this wind. It was the only voice he had tolerated for 5 years, its howl a fitting companion to the vast, quiet ache inside him. His homestead was a lonely testament to endurance, a small cabin hunkered against a low rise, its wooden door a single, unblinking eye staring out at the dusty vastness. He moved with the deliberate, weary rhythm of a man who expects nothing from the day but the work it demands. Each morning began in the frosty air, his breath a pale ghost in the smoky lamp light. He would check his traps, chop wood, and mend fences, his movements economical and sure. He chopped wood deep into the night sometimes, as if splitting his own guilt into pieces small enough to be burned away. The sound of the axe was a sharp, lonely punctuation in the immense silence of the wilderness. His shoulders were broad, weathered by sun and labor, but they carried a weariness that went beyond muscle. His eyes, the color of a slate evening sky, had seen too much and now chose to see as little as possible. They were tired eyes that have seen everything. Inside the cabin, life was pared down to necessity. A tin cup, a single plate, a hard-tacked bed. On the wall hung a shovel, clean and ready, a tool he had used only once for a task that had hollowed him out completely. Up on the hill, under a solitary, twisted pine, was a small mound of stones. He never went there, but he knew its location with every beat of his suppressed heart. He was a man living in the aftermath, emotionally numb, his only connection to the world the raw, physical sensations of his labor. The sting of the wind on his skin was a substitute for the feeling he no longer allowed. He was reclusive, a ghost on his own land, and that was how he intended to remain. But the wilderness, for all its emptiness, had a way of delivering what a man least expected. His supplies were running low. The thought of town, with its noise and its people, was a bitter taste in his mouth, but salt and flour were not things the land provided. He saddled his horse, the creak of leather loud in the morning stillness, and rode out, his face a rigid mask set against the world. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. The town of Redemption was little more than a dusty street clinging to life, a place where hope came to die. Elias tethered his horse outside the general store, his gaze sweeping the street with practiced disinterest. He saw her then. She was standing outside the saloon, a woman who seemed to be made of the same dust as the road, so worn down she was almost transparent. She held a small child clutched to her side, a boy with wide, frightened eyes who mirrored her own rigid stillness. She was coatless in the biting wind, her dress thin and frayed, her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture that was both protective and utterly futile. He saw the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the raw fear in the way she flinched when the saloon door swung open. A man emerged, massive and red-faced, his presence radiating a greasy authority. This was Henderson, a man who owned half the town and everyone in it. "There you are," Henderson boomed, his voice thick with contempt. "Think you can just walk away? You owe me." The woman said nothing. Her silence was not defiant, but exhausted, the silence of a creature that has learned noise only invites more pain. Her true identity was not one of riches or station, but of a quiet strength and maternal dignity that Henderson could never comprehend. She appeared broken, a disguised state born of necessity, but she was not shattered. She was alert. The man grabbed her arm. "You'll work it off." Every last cent, at the sight of the man's hand on her. Something in Elias shifted. A memory flickered. A fever, a helpless plea, a hand he hadn't been there to hold. It was a ghost of a feeling, but it was enough. He moved without thinking. It was an impulsive act, a direct contradiction to the numb, reclusive life he had so carefully constructed. He walked across the street, his footsteps heavy in the dust. He stopped before Henderson, his tall, weathered frame casting a long shadow. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. Henderson sneered. "What's it to you, drifter?" Elias's gaze dropped to the woman, then to the child who was now hiding behind her legs. He saw the single, tearless tremor that ran through her. He reached into his coat, his hand closing around the worn leather pouch that held his entire worth. He pulled out a $10 gold piece, the last of his money until he could sell some pelts. He held it out. "For her debt," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like cracking ice. Henderson's eyes widened at the coin, his greed overriding his bluster. He snatched it from Elias's hand. "Fine. She's paid up. Worthless baggage anyway." He spit on the ground and stomped back into the saloon. The woman froze, staring at Elias. She shivered, a deep, convulsive tremor that came from suspicion, not just the cold. He had freed her, but he was still a man, a stranger, and she had learned that no kindness came without a price. He remained silent. Then, "If you want to stay." He didn't finish the sentence, gesturing vaguely with his head towards the vast, empty land behind him. She looked from his impassive face to the saloon door, then back. She gave a single, jerky nod. He had just acted against his nature, and the consequences of that act were now standing before him, trembling in the dust. The ride to the homestead was a study in silence. She sat stiffly on the horse behind him, the small boy held tight in her lap, her hands hovering just above Elias's waist, careful not to touch. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy blanket woven from fear and uncertainty. He could feel her rigidity, the coiled tension of an animal expecting a blow. He was a stranger who had paid for her, and in her world that meant he owned her. The thought was a raw, uncomfortable weight in his gut. He had acted out of a buried remorse, a sudden, sharp need to do one right thing in a life full of wrong. But he had no idea what to do now. He was a man who had forgotten how to speak, and she was a woman who was too afraid to. As the dusty sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, his small cabin appeared, a dark shape against the slate evening sky. He dismounted and turned to help her down, but she flinched away from his outstretched hand, sliding to the ground on her own. She stood there, clutching the boy, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape, the lonely cabin, the deepening fog in the hollows. This was not a rescue. It was an exchange of one prison for another. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it mirrored his own. What had he done? He led them to the wooden door, the creak of its hinges loud and mournful. The single room was cold and dark. He lit the smoky lamp, its pale light revealing the stark emptiness of his life. A stove, a table, his bedroll in the corner. That was all. He gestured to a small, partitioned-off area behind a hanging blanket, originally intended for storage. "You can stay there," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. She did not look at him. She took the boy, whose name he still didn't know, and disappeared behind the worn fabric. A moment later, her voice came, small and thin, stripped of everything but desperation. "I ain't saying nothin'," she whispered through the blanket. "Just don't send me back." He stood motionless in the center of the room, the metal of the lamp feeling cold in his hand. He had brought two strangers into his sanctuary of silence, and their fear was a palpable presence, louder than any conversation. He unrolled his own blanket and lay down near the stove, as far from her as he could get. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the new sounds in his home. The woman's soft, suppressed breathing, the child's occasional whimper in his sleep. The familiar creak of the floorboards under his own weight now seemed to echo her presence. A deep, unsettling separation existed between them, a chasm of distrust and unspoken history, all contained within the four walls of his cabin. She stayed. The days that followed fell into a quiet, deliberate rhythm of avoidance. They were two ghosts haunting the same small space, their paths crossing without ever touching. He would rise before the pale winter sun, leaving the cabin while she and the boy were still asleep behind the blanket. He would return late, long after the sun had set, to find a portion of the food he'd left out had been eaten. He never saw her cook it. He only saw the evidence. A clean tin cup by the water bucket, a plate scrubbed and set aside. She was unobtrusive, a shadow moving through the edges of his life. Her name was Sarah, and the boy was Samuel. He learned this only by listening through the wall as she soothed the child in a low, gentle murmur. For her part, Sarah moved with the cautious, alert stillness of a doe in a hunter's territory. She kept her corner of the cabin immaculate. She mended their own worn-down clothes with thread she had pulled from a spare sack. She did not speak to him. She did not look at him. Her silence was a wall, and he did not know how to breach it. Her initial fear had settled into a deep, watchful suspicion. She endured. But the man, Elias, was not what she had expected. He was silent, yes, and his presence was as massive and weathered as an old rock. But there was no cruelty in him. There was only a profound, concealed sadness. She saw it in the way he stared at the fire, his eyes lost in a place she couldn't see. She saw it in the weary set of his shoulders as he returned from a day of hard labor. He was a man nursing a raw, private wound. He began to help her in small, secret ways. One morning, she awoke to find a thick, woolen blanket, his own spare, folded neatly outside her curtained space. It was old but clean and warm. Another day, she found that the boy's worn-out shoes, which had holes in the soles, had been repaired with a new, sturdy piece of leather, the stitching small and honest. He must have done it in the dead of night, while they slept. He would leave an extra piece of dried meat on the table, or a handful of winterberries he'd found. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet, unobtrusive offerings, placed without expectation. They were acts of a man who had forgotten the language of kindness but still remembered the grammar. Each small intervention was a question he didn't know how to ask. Sarah's fragile hope, long dormant, began to awaken. She would find the mended shoe and her hand would tremble as she touched the careful stitches. She would wrap the boy in the warm blanket and swallow against a tightness in her throat. She began to see that his silence was not a threat. It was a shield much like her own. One afternoon, while he was out, she took a bold step. She found his tin cup, which was dented and stained, and spent an hour scrubbing it with sand and ash until it shone. She placed it back exactly where she had found it. When he returned that night, he picked up the cup. He froze, his fingers tracing the clean, smooth rim. He looked over at the blanket dividing the room. He said nothing, but for the first time, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a shared space. The change came with the snow. It began as a light dusting, a pretty lie on the desolate landscape, but by evening, it had transformed into a raging blizzard. The biting wind howled like a hungry wolf, throwing sheets of white against the cabin and piling drifts against the wooden door. The world outside vanished into a churning vortex of frosty air and cracking ice. Inside, the small cabin became their entire world, an arc of flickering lamplight in a sea of white. The storm forced a proximity they had so carefully avoided. For 2 days they were trapped, the rhythm of their separate lives broken. The silence grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Elias kept the stove fed, the warmth a fragile defense against the cold that seeped through the walls. Sarah rationed their food, her movements calm and deliberate, a quiet dignity in the face of the storm's fury. It was on the third night that the real crisis struck. Samuel began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the howl of the wind. By morning he was burning with fever. His small body was limp, his breathing shallow. Sarah crouched by his side, her face a mask of terror. She bathed his forehead with a damp rag, her hands trembling. She had seen this fever before. It had taken other children in dusty wayside towns, and she had no medicine, no knowledge beyond a mother's desperate love. She was alone, trapped by the storm, her child fading before her eyes. The boy's breathing grew more ragged. A soft, guttural moan escaped her lips. It was the first sound of pure, unshielded emotion he had ever heard from her. She looked up, her eyes wide with a terror that finally dwarfed her fear of him. She had no choice. She pushed back the blanket and stumbled into the main room. "Help me," she whispered, the words torn from her. "Please." He was on his feet in an instant. He knelt beside the boy, his large, weathered hand gently touching Samuel's forehead. The heat was alarming. He looked at Sarah, at the raw plea in her eyes, and the last of his emotional numbness shattered. He remembered another small, hot forehead, another mother's desperate plea. This time he would not fail. "There's a willow grove down by the creek," he said, his voice steady and calm. "The bark. It breaks a fever." The journey was a battle. He tied a rope from the cabin to the treeline so he wouldn't get lost in the whiteout. The wind tore at him, stinging his skin, but he pushed through, driven by a protective instinct he thought had died years ago. He returned, covered in snow, his hands raw, but clutching a bundle of willow bark. Together, they boiled it into a bitter tea. He held the boy, propping him up, while Sarah gently spooned the liquid into his mouth. They worked through the night, a silent, focused team. He kept the fire roaring. She kept the cool cloths on Samuel's head. They moved around each other, their shared purpose creating a new, unspoken language. Sometime before dawn, the boy's fever broke. His breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. Sarah sagged with relief, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. She looked at Elias across the sleeping child, the smoky lamplight catching the glint of tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Something had broken open between them, something more than just the silence. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The dusty vastness was gone, replaced by a clean, unspoiled canvas under a pale winter sun. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed just as profoundly. The fever had burned away the last of Sarah's suspicion, and the shared ordeal had breached the walls of Elias's solitude. A fragile connection had been forged in the heart of the storm. That morning, for the first time, she did not wait for him to leave. She built up the fire and cooked a small breakfast of cornmeal, setting a plate for him on the table. When he came over to the stove, she didn't retreat behind her curtain. She simply stood by the table, her hands clasped in front of her. He sat down. He ate the meal. The silence was different now. It was comfortable, a shared quiet rather than a tense void. "He's better," Elias said, his voice still rough but gentler than before. "He's strong," she replied softly. It was their first real conversation, simple words carrying the weight of all that had passed between them. He nodded, finishing his meal. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a consequence or a burden, but as the woman who had brought a quiet, unobtrusive warmth into his cold existence. He saw the dignity in her posture, the deep, resilient intelligence in her tired eyes. But the past was not a ghost that could be so easily laid to rest. A few days later, as Elias was splitting wood, he heard the sound of approaching horses. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. 2 riders were making their way up the track to his homestead. One of them was Henderson, his massive frame overflowing his saddle, his face set in a mask of smug determination. The other was a hired man, thin and weaselly. Elias put down his axe, his body going still. He felt Sarah freeze in the doorway of the cabin behind him. She had seen them too. Henderson reined in his horse, looking from Elias to the cabin with a proprietary sneer. "I've come for my property," he announced, his voice booming in the clean, frosty air. He wasn't looking at Elias, he was looking at Sarah. "A deal's a deal, but I've decided I want my investment back." With interest, he dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow. "Come on, girl. Your free ride is over." Sarah flinched as if struck. The boy, Samuel, ran to her, clinging tightly to her legs. She instinctively pulled him behind her, her body forming a shield. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. She had been worn down, but she would not be broken again. Elias took a slow step forward, placing himself between Henderson and the cabin door. He was silent, his weathered face unreadable, but his stance was as solid and unyielding as the frozen earth beneath his feet. He was the moral center of this small, forgotten place, and his silence was no longer a sign of retreat. It was the calm before a storm of his own. Henderson laughed, a cruel, barking sound that shattered the peace of the snowy landscape. "Get out of the way, farmer. This ain't your concern." He took another step forward, his hand reaching for Sarah. "She belongs to me. I've got a piece of paper says so." He was trying to humiliate her, to reduce her to an object, a piece of property to be reclaimed. He wanted to parade his power in front of this silent man who had dared to defy him. Sarah lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the insult. The old fear, the familiar shame, washed over her. All the fragile hope of the past few days felt like a foolish dream. The world was as it had always been, brutal, loud, and owned by men like Henderson. But then Elias moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stepped forward again, his body a firm, protective barrier in front of her. He was silent but firm, a wall of quiet, earthy strength. The crowd of two fell silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and clear, carrying an authority that Henderson's shouting could never match. "She's with me," he said. He looked directly at Henderson, his slate-gray eyes holding no fear, only a deep, unshakable conviction. Then he added the words that would change everything. "Not bought." Chosen. The words hung in the frosty air, simple and profound. Chosen. It was a declaration not of ownership, but of partnership. It was a public acknowledgement of her worth, her humanity. It was the ultimate act of salvation, performed not with a gun, but with a quiet, honest truth. Henderson froze, his sneer faltering. He looked at Elias's massive, broad-shouldered frame, at the unwavering certainty in his eyes. He saw a man who was not defending property, but protecting his own. There was a line here, a moral line drawn in the snow, and Henderson knew he could not cross it. He was a bully, and bullies only understood a strength greater than their own. With a muttered curse, he turned, heaved himself back onto his horse, and rode away without another word, his hired man scrambling after him. The threat was gone. Sarah stood in the sudden, ringing silence, the tension draining out of her in a long, shuddering breath. She looked at the back of the man who had stood for her, who had given her back her dignity with two simple words. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, then another. She began to cry, not from shame or fear, but from a relief so overwhelming it felt like pain. He stayed. He didn't turn around, didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent guardian, until her tears subsided, letting his presence be her anchor in a world that had finally, blessedly, shifted on its axis. That evening, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. The fire in the stove crackled, casting a warm, gentle light on the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the world was settling into the deep, quiet hush of a winter night. The wind whispered through the dry grass poking out of the snow, a soft, mournful sound. Sarah and Elias sat on the small porch he had built, a narrow ledge overlooking the vast, moonlit expanse. They sat not touching, but the space between them was no longer a chasm. It was a shared stillness. She had to break it. She had to give voice to the gratitude that was swelling in her heart. "No one has ever done that for me," she said, her voice soft, almost trembling. "Stood for me." He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the horizon, on the line where the white earth met the star-dusted sky. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. He had not just saved her from Henderson. He had saved her from the person Henderson had tried to make her believe she was. She waited, and in the growing, comfortable silence, she sensed he had something to say as well. "There's a grave," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. Up on the hill, he pointed with his chin toward the solitary pine, a dark silhouette against the moon. "My wife, and my daughter. Fever took them. 5 years ago." The confession was stark, unadorned, delivered with the same raw honesty as everything else about him. He had been living with two ghosts, and now he was finally introducing them. The story of his guilt, his retreat from the world, was all there in those few spare words. He had failed to protect them, and so he had walled himself off, his silence a penance. Sarah breathed softly, a wave of understanding washing over her. His numbness, his solitude, his sudden, fierce protection of her and Samuel. It all made sense. He was not a cold man. He was a man frozen in grief. She looked at his large, weathered hands resting on his knees, hands that could chop wood, mend a shoe, or stand firm against a tyrant. Impulsively, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his arm. The fabric of his coat was rough, but she could feel the warmth of him beneath it. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was forgiveness. It was companionship. It was a promise that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. He flinched, just for a second, and used to a gentle touch. Then he relaxed, letting her hand rest there. They sat that way for a long time, two solitary people finding solace in the quiet presence of the other. The past had been spoken. The wounds had been acknowledged. As the moon climbed higher, she spoke again, her voice a near whisper, filled with a new, growing hope. "Keep me, Elias," she said, her words a quiet prayer. "I want to be your wife." It was not the plea of a desperate woman, but the offer of a resilient survivor who had finally found a place worthy of her strength. He turned his head and looked at her then, really looked at her in the pale moonlight. And in her tired, dignified eyes, he saw not a replacement for what he had lost, but a chance for a new beginning. Spring arrived as a slow, tender promise. The cracking ice on the creek gave way to a gentle murmur. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides, and the dusty sun felt warm on the skin for the first time in months. The homestead, once a monument to one man's grief, began to transform. It was becoming a home. Sarah, with a quiet energy that seemed to blossom with the season, started a small garden near the cabin. She turned the dark, earthy soil with a shovel, planting seeds she had carefully saved. Samuel, now a healthy, curious boy, chased butterflies, his laughter a bright, new sound that the wind carried across the plains. Elias found himself working with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He repaired the roof, built a new, sturdier fence for a milk cow he planned to buy, and extended the porch. They worked in a comfortable, easy rhythm, often in silence, but it was a silence rich with understanding and shared intention. He would watch her as she crouched in her garden, her hands in the dirt, a gentle smile on her face. He saw not a woman he had saved, but a partner who was saving him, bringing life back to his fallow heart. Her presence was a calm, reliable anchor. She, in turn, saw the deep, suppressed tenderness in him finally surface. She saw it in the way he showed Samuel how to carve a whistle from a reed, his large hands surprisingly gentle. She saw it in the way he looked at her across the dinner table, a quiet, growing warmth in his eyes. They were a family, forged not by law or ceremony, but by shared hardship and a slow, patient rediscovery of trust. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. This is the quiet miracle of the human heart. Love does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it grows in the silent spaces, in the shared routines of work and survival, where no one is looking. It takes root in the soil of mutual respect and is watered by small, honest gestures. It is a stubborn, resilient thing, much like the wildflowers that began to dot the plains around the homestead, pushing up through the hard, unforgiving ground to reach for the sun. One evening, Elias sat on the porch, a block of seasoned pine in his lap. He worked with a small, sharp knife, his movements sure and practiced. Shavings fell to the floorboards as, night after night, he slowly coaxed a shape from the wood. Sarah would watch him, a quiet question in her eyes, but she did not ask. She knew he would show her when he was ready. He was carving a gift, an offering, a symbol of the future he was finally ready to build. He worked on it for weeks, in the quiet moments after the day's labor was done. The block of wood slowly transformed under his patient hands. He carved for sturdy legs, a smooth, curved seat, and 2 long, elegant rockers. It was a small rocking chair, perfectly sized for a child. It was a cradle for a new life, a symbol of permanence, a promise of stories to be read and lullabies to be sung. It was everything he had been unable to say. One night he brought it inside. The smoky lamplight gleamed on the polished wood. He set it down on the floorboards near the stove, a solid, beautiful thing in the rustic cabin. Samuel, who had been dozing, woke up and stared at it, his eyes wide with wonder. Sarah rose from her seat, her hands pressed to her heart. She ran her fingers over the smooth, curved back. It was more than a chair. It was a piece of his heart, given form. It was an answer to the question she had whispered on the porch months ago. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The silence in the room was full of love, a quiet, powerful presence that filled every corner. He had built a home with his hands, and now he had furnished it with his heart. He walked to the window and pushed it open, letting in the cool night air and the scent of damp earth and blooming sage. The future was no longer a terrifying, empty expanse. It was this room. It was her. He turned back to her, and for the first time, a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. "Stay here," he said. It was not a question or a command. It was a simple statement of fact. This was their home. She nodded, her own smile answering his. She stayed. The homestead thrived. Winter passed into a gentle spring, and their quiet life took root and grew strong. A true home had been made. We'll see you again, where silence means home. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Their story is a reminder that the deepest connections are often forged not in grand declarations, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of shared days and the courage to offer a gentle hand in a harsh world. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that even in the most desolate landscapes of the heart, kindness, like a stubborn wildflower, can find a way to grow, and that true strength is often found in the quiet dignity of endurance. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most.